Should I sing to the King of Kings? You are my everything, and I will. Clothed in rainbows of living color, flashes of lightning, rolls of thunder, blessing and orchestra. Praise to the King of Kings. You are my everything, and I will adore you. Yes, I love God Almighty, words and deeds and days to come. Yeah, with all creation I sing praise to the King of Kings. You are my everything, and I will adore you. soul runs deep. Your grace is more. Where grace is found is where you are, and where you are, Lord, I am free, and holiness is Christ in me, and where you are, Lord, I am free, and holiness is Christ in me.
Father, who art in heaven, Jesus, hallowed be thy name. You are so great. The kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. This can't be how you meant for things. Help me to spread your love around here. Give us this day our daily bread. Please watch out for me today. Forgive us our trespasses. Forgive me for taking you for granted, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And help me to forgive others as you've forgiven me. Lead us not into temptation. There's so many distractions going on in my life right now. Keep me focused, but deliver us from evil. Please keep me pure. Keep me safe. Just help me to live my life like you want me to. Thanks. I love you. Amen. Amen.
Well, I think I'm on. Yep. Good job, Sean. Thank you. Welcome to start of our brand new series. Now, if this is your first time with us, if you're a first-time guest, hey, first of all, I'm so glad that you are here. So I don't feel like I'm very loud. Okay. You'll get it. There it is. Nice. Very good. So if you haven't been with us before, like I said, if you're your first time, then what you may or may not know is that we preach in a 6-week series, right? So like sometimes they're a little bit shorter than that, sometimes a little bit longer than that, but generally that's about how long we go until starting a brand new series. So if today's your first day, you're in luck, because you don't have to like try to figure out where we've been at or anything. You get like the first shot of everything today. So we're glad that you are here. Now the title of this series today is called How to Pray. How to Pray. And right off the bat, I was a little bit nervous because there's something about this title, and some of you are like, what? There's something offensive about it? Yeah, there's something offensive about it because the thing is that I've made some assumptions when it comes into this series called How to Pray. And the first one is that you have some sort of interest in prayer, right? I mean, I don't go out and buy wedding magazines. I have zero interest in wedding. In fact, when I was getting married, I had zero interest in wedding magazines, right? Golf Digest, not coming to my house every week, all right? Every month, I don't even know how often it comes, right? Because it's something that I'm interested in, but I pay every single month for Sirius Radio. And you say, what? Why would somebody pay for radio? Because in fact, I may actually be obsessed with fantasy football. But that's kind of our last series, not series. So I'm okay with telling you that I'm obsessed with fantasy football. And I pay a subscription to a radio station to be able to listen to a fantasy football radio channel that's all that they talk about. And I love it. I love it because I'm interested in it. And so when it comes to this idea about how to pray, I've kind of assumed that you have some sort of interest in prayer. Now, I feel like I stand on some good grounds on this because Pew Research has done lots of different religious and non-religious studies on things, and they've done a lot of work on and what Americans think about prayer. In fact, several years ago in 2015, they did a study, and they said that 6 out of 10 Americans prayed daily, at least one time a day, even if that was at night before going to bed, maybe it was over a meal that they were having together, but 6 out of 10 people in America said, hey, I pray at least once a day. And a couple years later, they followed that up, and they wanted to see if there were more people who were actually praying than just praying daily, and so they called, in 2017, they called a whole bunch of Americans, and they found that 82% of Americans said that they had prayed at least once in the last months. At least once in the last 3 months. And I was like, wow, that's a whole lot of us who seem to have some sort of interest or some sort of experience with prayer on some level. But Newsweek went a little bit further. And in 2012, they published an article, and check out what it is that they said. Not my words, all right? This is what they wrote. They said, more people prayed than did any of the following 3 things: exercised, went to work, or had sex. Interesting. Okay, well, with that, I feel like maybe we have some interest, and there's that first assumption about you having some interest in this topic of prayer is probably there. But there's a second part to this, and by the way, maybe you're sitting out there and you're like, you know what? I'm not in that 6 out of 10. I'm not in that 80%. And I'm not really sure that I would fit in that Newsweek article. Maybe that's you. Listen, I think that you will learn some things about prayer and about what it's for and why it is that it's good. And I think you're going to find some things about absolutely fascinating. So even if you're in that other percentage, hang on, all right? Don't go anywhere yet, because I think that you'll enjoy the things that come out of this series. All right, but there's a second assumption about it. And the second assumption is that you already know how to pray, right? That you don't already know how to pray. Now, this one is really kind of the one that's a little bit more offensive. The interest one, you're like, oh, maybe. I mean, I could see how somebody, if they're not interested, be a little bit. But this one, you know, it's like I've been listening in, and I've heard some of your prayers somewhere, and was like, boy, that Andy, I don't think we have any Andys in the room, right? No Andys in the room right now. Okay, good. That Andy doesn't know how to pray. I've really listened to everything that he's saying. And what Andy really needs is for me to teach him a series on how to pray, right? It's like, you know, a little bit of nervous laughter from me and maybe from you right now, because you're kind of like, oh man, I wonder if like he just substituted a name to protect the innocent right there, and what he's really saying is my name and not Andy's name on that. And you know, really, I just want you to understand that for the last month, all of your phones have recorded all of your prayers and been sending it to me. So I know how you pray. Oh, I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding. That'd be scary though if they did that, wouldn't it? Maybe they are. Maybe they are sending it off to data or to Google on all of that. But saying that we're going to do a series on how to pray is like saying to someone after they've prayed for a meal or been praying somewhere that, hey, you know what? I would just like to give you like some points, some tips, some helps on how to pray. So for the next couple of weeks, could we get together and I'll talk to you about how to pray, right? If somebody did that, I might punch them. I would be that kind of offended. And so I was a little bit nervous as we came into this, because this kind of has that kind of feeling to it, because you kind of might be thinking, well, why in the world are we going to do a series about how to pray? And really, not only do you have to have some interest in this series, but you have to have some interest in how to fix what it is that's going on, right? I don't watch car repair videos unless something is broken on my car and I am forced to in order to figure out how to repair it, right? Like how to figure out how to get to a battery casing that's between the front and the back seats on the floorboard. Who would ever know that unless you watch some YouTube video on that? So thanks, Sean. I appreciate that you would have known that, because I didn't know that. I wouldn't have any sort of reason to watch any other videos on my car unless I had an intent to fix something that's going on with it. So here it is, starting a series on how to pray. And I think most of us have some sort of interest in it. And we have some sort of desire inside of us to say, I don't know that I'm doing it right. We have some sort of desire to want to fix something that's there. And that's why a series on. Now, if you've been around church for any amount of time, maybe you went as a kid, maybe it's your first time coming back since you went as a kid, maybe you've been around church for a really long time, you've possibly heard this statement before. But lots of people have said this. They said, prayer is not hard, it's just fill in the blank for me, talking to God, right? Anybody here ever heard that before? Oh yeah, I've heard it lots. I've probably even said it before. And so if it's really not hard, why in the world 6 weeks are we going to talk about how to pray? Well, first of all, it's because I talk a lot. A lot of you are going, yeah, exactly. I heard some amens on that one, I think. Yeah. But really, I think that simple statement about prayer is not hard, it is just talking to God, is really false. At best, it's maybe a half-truth, right? And you're like, oh, okay, if it's a half-truth, then what would you say prayer is, Charles? Well, here's what I think prayer is, and see if this resonates a little bit better with you. I think that prayer is a meaningful conversation with God. I see some heads nodding on that. It's not just talking to God, but it's a meaningful conversation with him. Because at the end of the day, I think when we come to God with prayer, that's what it is that we're longing for. We're this sort of meaningful, this meaning-filled, this full conversation with God. That's what we want. But if we were honest, I don't think it takes much for us to be honest in this room, but if we were honest with ourselves, I think we would all agree that we've probably lost the art of communication. We're not very good at it. Social media, right? You can go post whatever you want, and there's no consequences for what it is that you post, because you don't have to read what everybody else says after you drop the bomb of it. You can say whatever is on your mind and your heart. Text messaging, right? There's no art of communication in text messaging. Because if somebody misreads it, you can just tell them later, well, you just misread what I said. I've used that one before to get out of trouble. Right? And not only that, but most of us in this room, we're transplants from somewhere else. And so we don't have the same sort of relationships that maybe we grew up with all around us. And so we've lost this art and interaction and engaging with other people. And so all of these things, they really make us pretty terrible at conversation. Really terrible at it. In fact, I began this and I was like, listen, if I'm bad at conversation with other people that I can see, and that I can read their body language, how much harder is prayer when I'm praying to a God that I cannot see? And I cannot read the body language. I can't tell if I am boring him to death with what I'm talking about right now, right? I know with my wife, I get the full eye roll going on, and she's like off doing something else. I'm like, she's bored to tears right now. I just need to move on with the world. But I can't do that with God, and I can't figure out if something's like confusing him about what it is that I'm trying to communicate to him, because I can't see him. And so we struggle. We struggle enough to convey our feelings and to communicate things, let alone to have to deal with this issue of not being able to do that. And that's just supposing that we're just talking to somebody, let alone trying to have a meaningful conversation with them. Right? And at the end of the day, when we're engaged in a meaningful conversation, or the goal of communication, right? The goal of communication is that we want to be understood by the person that we're communicating with. We want to create some sort of action and relationship based on the communication and the conversation. I think all of us would say, hey, if I am having a meaningful conversation with my spouse, that's it. That's what I want to have happen. I want my spouse to understand me better because of what it is that we've engaged with. I want some sort of action to take place because of what we've conversed about. I want some sort of relationship to be deepened because of what just transpired. Most of us wish it would happen with our kids. That's, never going to happen, just that we all understand that. But that's what we want. And I would say that not only do we struggle with this with our spouse and with our kids, but we struggle with this with our coworkers. We struggle with this with our bosses, right? Because we are not very good at communication. We're not very good at meaningful conversation. And if prayer is a meaningful conversation with God, no wonder we feel like our prayer is lacking. One lady, she described her prayer life like this. She said, it's like there's a 20-foot high brick wall in front of me. She said, and I'm heaving things over the brick wall. And first of all, I'm just hoping to get it up and over the wall as best as I can. And then she said that once she does that, she doesn't know if there's even somebody on the other side who's receiving the prayers. You ever feel like that? You're just doing your best to try to heave a prayer up, and you're like, I don't even know. And I wonder if it feels satisfying, because that's where we spend all of the effort and the work. And so maybe if you do pray, or maybe really this is the reason that you don't pray, right? Because you feel like this lady, and we have these questions that pop up in the back of our mind. Questions like, does God or anyone really hear my prayer? That one shows up, right? Is God really a part of this conversation? Does prayer really even work? What if I don't get the answer that I want? What then? Do I really need prayer? Or is it really that God needs my prayer, right? Is this like some sort of like cosmic fuel source, right? And so like by me praying, like it all of a sudden opens up everything. And because I prayed, now God does things and he has the power to do things on stuff. And so like, you know, is that what prayer is? Is there a right way to pray? Is there a right place to pray? Like if I climb higher up in the mountains, does God hear me better? Right? We've all had these questions run through our minds about prayer. So it's not really like one question, it's a bunch of questions. And we don't really talk much about how to do it. It's sort of prayers like this, like, hey, if you'll just watch and mimic somebody else, right? And at the end of the day, that feels incredibly disingenuous to who we are. Because we're just doing something that somebody else was doing. And we don't even know if they're doing that because it's the right thing to do, or if they're doing it because they watched somebody else before them do it, and so they're just mimicking somebody else who was doing this before them, and so on and so forth, and so goes the crazy cycle. So maybe we really do need a series on how to pray. Maybe we do need several weeks to begin to unpack these sort of ideas, because at the end of the day, I think that most of us want to find a way of praying that brings richness and hope to our lives. We want to do better than just stutter and daydream or say some sort of rote, mindless repetition, right? We want to talk to God. We want to have a relationship. We want to relate to God. We want, especially if you do pray, I want you to begin to ask yourself the question through this series: what would it look like if I had a meaningful conversation with God? What would it look like if I had a meaningful conversation with God? Now, that question, by the way, is not unique to you and me. That question, in fact, is found in the Bible. In Luke chapter 11, Jesus was praying, and in just a moment we're going to look at it, and we're going to find that Jesus' disciples, the guys who had been running around with him, right, hanging out with him day in and day out, that they finally got up the nerve and came up to Jesus and said, Jesus, will you teach us how to pray? So if you've got your Bibles, if not, we'll put it up on the screen. We're going to start in Luke 11, Luke chapter 11. And it says this, starting in verse 1. It says, now Jesus was praying, and he was praying in a certain place. And when he had finished, one of his disciples said to him, Lord, teach us to pray, just like John taught his disciples. And Jesus said to them, when you pray, say. Check. Oh, there I am. All right, that'll last for a little bit. We'll see how long. So these guys have been hanging out with Jesus for over 2 years, traveling with him and watching him pray. And what they had seen over this time was something that was so different. All right? Now get this. These guys were Jewish teenagers, right? Now, some of you you just heard something absolutely incredible in that statement. That the guys who were following Jesus were teenagers, right? Some of you have never thought about the fact that the disciples were teenagers. I know, mind-blowing. I don't know how he did it. I don't know how he hung out with teenagers all day, every day for 3.5 years, right? I don't know. But here's what I want you to catch in spite of the moment is the fact that they were Jewish. All right? And the fact that they were Jewish meant that they had memorized huge sections of the Old Testament. It was all that they had for the Bible for them, but we would call it the Old Testament. So all of the prayers that were in the Old Testament, all Psalms that were there that are like, hey, I'm offering this up to God. All of the times that any of the heroes of the faith, you name them, Abraham, Moses, David, you keep on going. Come on, all of them. Hannah. Prayer after prayer that are recorded in the Old Testament. These guys knew those prayers. And some of you are like, I didn't even know some of those prayers existed in the Old Testament. It's okay. These guys knew them. And so they prayed them all the time. And so they come to Jesus because they realize that something is fundamentally different between what they were doing and what Jesus was doing. You see, day in and day out, they would watch Jesus. And Jesus would do these incredible miracles and wonders and signs. He'd be healing people. He'd be teaching people. He'd pour his entire self out. There was nothing left of Jesus. And then he would retreat and he'd go away, kind of like what happened right here. He goes away to a certain place and he would begin to pray and he would come back and he'd be filled up and refreshed and ready to pour out all over again. And the disciples said, that's different. That's different. We try to do this sort of a thing. And they saw this connection between Jesus' prayer and Jesus' power. That one didn't happen without the other. Didn't have his power without the prayer that went before it and the prayer that followed after it. And so the disciples said, listen, Jesus, will you teach us how to pray? How to do what it is that you're doing? And so Jesus looks at them, and when he sees their hearts, and he sees their desires, instead of telling them to just go back to the Old Testament and look at all the things that were in the Old Testament and all of those prayers, Jesus, when you pray, pray like this. When you pray like this. Now, not if you pray, right? Jesus doesn't say if you pray. He says when you pray. Now, if you're not a Jesus follower in the room, for just a second, okay, this is your one moment that you can close your eyes and tune out for just a second, all right? This is your moment because I'm going to talk to those of you that are Jesus followers because Jesus was talking directly to his disciples, to his followers that were there. And he starts by telling them that prayer is not an optional thing. He says when, not if you think about it, if you feel like it, whatever's going on. He says when. When you pray, do it like this. So it's not an optional thing. In other words, he says, you are going to do this. You're going to do this. If you're not a Jesus follower. Let that one sink in for a second. Because Jesus said, listen, prayer is central to the life of a Jesus follower. Prayer is central to the life of a Jesus follower. Jesus is so incredibly smart because he understood something. And he was trying to impart a truth to his disciples that I think we miss. And we're going to talk about this today. And that is this idea. Prayer is for you. Prayer is for you. And this is a huge statement. Right? Some of you are mulling this over in your mind. And really, we're just going to unpack this for the next little bit, right? And I want to see if I can help us to understand a little bit about what this is. And so we're going to flip over to another place where this same prayer shows up. It shows up in Matthew chapter 6. So if you've got your Bibles, just flip back about this much, right? So just backwards towards Matthew a little bit, chapter 6, because Jesus teaches this to the disciples after they come and ask him how to pray here in Luke chapter 11. But there's another time that Jesus teaches this prayer. And this prayer is found in Matthew's Gospel, chapter 6, in the middle of the Sermon on the Mount. Now, if you were here for our last series called Happy, we looked at this Sermon on the Mount. We saw this is like Jesus' greatest sermon. And at the very beginning of it, he opened up and he talked about how it was to live a happy life, a blessed life, right? How to be happy. We looked at those 8 statements. But really, Jesus was setting up with those statements to come to what was the central part of that entire sermon, right in the very middle. And we don't think this way today, but teachers in the first century were very intentional about their content. All right? And they would, to highlight something, they would stick it right in the very middle. And that meant this is the most important piece, right in the middle of his sermon. Jesus gives this prayer, right? And this how to pray that's there. Now, Jesus takes this prayer that he had originally given to his disciples